This tutorial is for those who are experiencing problems with one or more of their analog thumbsticks on their DualShock 4 controller. Problems such as the ones listed here, which includes drift, where something in the game is moving on its own. Sometimes that movement involves stuttering or stopping when you're actually trying to move. Since these issues can be caused by a number of things, this video takes a kitchen sink approach to fixing the issue. I'll be showing you a lot of different solutions, starting with simple ones that can be done from the outside of the controller, then progressing onto more complex ones where you have to take it apart. So start with solution 1 and test your controller after doing it, and if that didn't fix it, move on to solution 2, and so on. Keep moving through the list until you resolve the issue or until you reach the end of your comfort level with doing intricate repair work. I'll be straight with you, a small percentage of you will not be able to resolve the issue with the things in this video. This is likely because your controller is completely worn down from being used. That being said, based on the comment sections on previous videos I've made about this subject, I estimate that about 80% of you will get some improvement with your situation using this video, and about half of you will be able to do that without even opening up your controller. As mentioned, you'll want to test your controller after each solution. An easy way to do it is to bring up hardwaretester.com on a PC or phone. The website has 4 different sections. Go to Gamepad Tester, then connect your controller via wire or Bluetooth to that device and hit any button on the controller. From there, it'll show indicators every time you press a button or move the analog stick. When you have drift, it can show in a couple of ways on this screen. When at rest, the dot that represents the analog stick may jitter a lot, or the dot may just be off-center when it's at rest. Small amounts of jitter or off-centerness may not affect anything in the game at all. It just depends on how the game is programmed. But large amounts of jitter or off-centerness will cause unintended behavior in the game. A dead zone can help, and I'll get into that in a minute. The cool thing is that you can do this test as you're doing some of these solutions I show you today. There's other apps and sites that allow you to test as well, but I'll put a link to hardwaretester.com in the description below. This isn't a sponsor, it's a free website, and a lot of people who do these types of repairs use it. The first solution is the most minimalist thing you can do, which is to cover up the issue by adjusting settings. One of the ways to do that is to adjust the dead zone. What is a dead zone? Well, in that last segment, I showed how your analog stick is represented by a dot, and it could be off-centered or jittery. By adjusting the dead zone, you can tell it to ignore a certain amount of off-centerness or jitteriness. Right here on this PS3 emulator, you can see how the left analog stick is jittery. Actually, both of them are. The red circle you see there is the dead zone. As long as the off-centerness or jitteriness is contained within the red circle, then my controller is going to function fine. If I adjust the sliders, I can increase or decrease the dead zone. If I make it this small, then there would be an issue. My character or the camera would move around. So why not make it super large so you never have an issue? If you do that, you'll be sacrificing precision in most games. It's going to take more of a push to get the controller to register that you're pushing the analog stick. The challenge to this solution is that there's no dead zone settings within the PS4 or PS5 menus, at least not at the time of this video. There may, however, be a dead zone setting within the in-game menu on whatever game you're playing. So go into your controller options within the game and just look around the menus and see if you see anything. This all assumes you can actually navigate the options with a wonky controller. If you're using a DualShock to play on Steam, you're in luck, because that does have a dead zone adjuster built right into the home screen menu. Here's the menu path to get there. If you're unable to use this dead zone feature, or it just doesn't work for your problem, head on to solution 2. This one is less likely to be useful to you, but just like you may be able to adjust the dead zone, you may also be able to reconfigure your buttons to resolve the issue. One way to do that is to remap your analog sticks. Although the PS4 and PS5 menus don't have a dead zone setting to adjust, they do allow you to remap. To get there on a PS4, go to Settings, Accessibility, move down and select Button Assignments. Checkmark this box right here. Select Customize Button Assignments. From here, if you select the L to L or the R to R, you can switch them. You can also switch L3 and R3. When you have it set, select Confirm to make it official. Again, I'm not sure if this is going to be useful to you because most of you probably play first-person shooters and one analog stick is camera and one analog stick is movement. So switching them isn't going to help. Your character is either going to be moving around on its own or the camera is going to be moving around. If you're not using the DualShock on a console, check the menu of the game you're playing. Just like with the dead zone settings, you may also be able to remap within the game itself. By the way, as far as I can see on Steam, you cannot switch buttons. If your problem is stuttering or stopping when you're trying to run in a first-person shooter, check your game's menu system for an option called Auto Run. This does have drawbacks. You won't be able to do slow movement in the game anymore. This one is a long shot, but I wanted to put it in here because this is the last thing you can try before going inside the controller. There's a little hole on the back. At the end of that hole is a button, and if you stick something in there and hold that button for 5 seconds, it resets the controller. I'm using a little tiny nail, but if you have a needle or something like that, it'll also work. By the way, if your controller has a dead battery, this will not work. So make sure it's charged at least a little bit. Now in doing this, your controller may forget what it was previously connected to, so you may have to do the pairing process all over again. If nothing has worked so far, it's time to start getting more hands-on and attempt to do some simple cleanings from the outside of the controller. This solution may sound like a prank, but hear me out. Turn the DualShock upside down and slap the back of it right behind the problematic thumbstick. After doing that a few times, rotate the controller about 45 degrees in one direction and push the problematic thumbstick toward the sky, and then tap it some more. Now, how is this supposed to help? For some people, their drift is caused by debris that has gotten down into the metal box that houses the thumbstick. It's pretty much an enclosed box with a large opening at the top where the stick comes out. Since you keep your controller upright most of the time, this box is like a trash can. Stuff just falls into it. You might be eating something and the crumbs might migrate, and if enough debris gets down in there, it can keep the stick from centering properly. By holding it upside down and slapping, some of that residue may come out of the trash can and it'll land on the bottom of the thumbstick, which is like an umbrella. So that's why I have you tilting the controller a certain way. We're trying to pour the debris out to the side. Otherwise, it would fall right back into the thumbstick. The drawback to doing this is that you may just be moving dirt from one place to another within the controller, and it may continue to migrate toward the other buttons or something. So go ahead and test and see if this worked, and if not, continue on to the next solution. Here's another bizarre one. Take a thin piece of cardboard from some product you have around the house and cut a wedge, like a slice of pizza. Take the wedge and insert one of the corners into the gap around the stick and move the wedge around, and also move the analog stick around. This may also be a good time to hit the like button on this video. If the wedge starts to wear down, simply rotate it and use one of the other corners. You don't want pieces of the wedge to get down in there. So how is this supposed to help? There may be sticky dirt, for lack of a better term, around the hole that the analog stick is sticking out of, or on the analog stick itself. That residue could impact the movement. The next thing they do is to get your vacuum cleaner attachment out, if your vacuum cleaner has one, and apply suction to the gap around the stick, moving the stick around as you do it. The idea here is to suck debris out of the thumbstick area, including any that you may have dislodged in the previous two solutions. This is the last of the non-invasive solutions, but it's one of the most effective solutions I show you today, based on feedback where I've showed this in other videos. Grab a straw, or roll up some paper and make a straw, and flatten the end a little bit, and blow into the gap around the stick. And just keep moving around the edge as you do this. It'll be more effective if you push the stick in the opposite direction in which you're blowing. You can also use canned air if you have that around. A hairdryer on the cold setting may also work. If you have none of these things, you can just put your mouth down on it and blow. The idea is to blow away debris that's inside the mechanism, but the challenge is getting the air movement around the curve of the umbrella. But like I said, many people in my previous videos have had success with this. I guess when you blow into an enclosed area, the air gets around easily. All the solutions I present to you from here on out will involve taking the controller apart. Please listen to the next segment as I lay out some warnings and some guidance on how to proceed with going inside the controller. The upcoming solutions involve taking the controller apart. Doing so involves some amount of risk. There are tiny wires, tiny ribbon cables, tiny plastic parts, and a tiny circuit board. You may unintentionally damage some of these, so just know that as you go forward with this video. That being said, I'll be explaining things in extreme detail and cautiously guiding you through the process. I advise against doing these solutions on your end at the same time as I do them in the video. Let me get ahead of you, or watch the segment in full and then go back and rewatch it and do the work at the same time. The reason I suggest this is because I might say something like, pull this ribbon out, unless you have a gate on the connector. If you took action before hearing the second half of the sentence, you may have broken something. And that has happened in the past in one of my videos because somebody was doing the work in real time and they didn't get to hear the disclaimers that come after I say things. Also note that the DualShock 4 was produced over a number of years. There are slight variations in how the inside of them are designed. I am primarily going to stick with one of the newer models in the upcoming segments, but I'll occasionally switch to a different model when there's an important difference to point out to you. This solution is yet another cleaning method, but this time we're going to go inside and take the umbrella caps off the sticks and do the cleaning from there. Just like every controller on the planet pretty much, the DualShock has two halves. And the first step is to separate those two halves. It's going to make your life a lot easier if you scrape out any gunk that has accumulated in the gap between those halves. That gunk can kind of act like a glue and make it hard to pull them apart. So just take any kind of small sharp instrument and run it along the fault line there. Same goes with the screws. Clean up any crud that has accumulated around them. Here's the 4 spots where the outside screws are. Remove them with a small Phillips screwdriver. This is the size of the bit that I used. If one of the screws still doesn't want to budge, try dropping 1 drop of water on it, let it soak for a minute, and then wipe the water back out. And also tap on the screw. Next, you need to separate the two shells, but hold on for a second while I point some things out. There's plastic tabs that keep the two sides together. For some people, these tabs will feel very tight, and in some cases, they may break as you pull the two halves apart. If they do, I recommend you don't worry about it, because those tabs are really redundant. Your controller will still go back together just fine. In fact, a while back, I did an experiment where I broke off every tab intentionally, and I was still able to put my controller back together because the 4 screws hold it back together just fine. If you do break one of those tabs, make sure you don't leave the pieces of it inside the controller, just turn it over and shake it out. Also note, there's a ribbon cable that connects the two halves, so you don't want to yank them too far apart and snap that cable. Later on, we're going to unplug that cable. Another thing I want to point out is, for some of you, part of the shell goes in between the top buttons like this. If so, take special care not to pull it in a way that rips off the L2 and R2 buttons. If they do come off though, they can just snap back into place. And the final tip I'll give you is to try to make sure the buttons are facing down when you're separating. Otherwise, the battery might fall out. So start separating the two halves. The best place to start is in the handles where the two pieces come together. try to do it by hand at first, but if it doesn't budge, try a prying tool if you have one around. When you get some separation, start applying more force, and it'll eventually just snap apart. Next, you'll need to disconnect the ribbon cable that connects the two halves. The best way to get the ribbon out is to pull on the little blue part. Don't pull it at an angle, pull it straight up. When you do get it out, try to remember which way the metal contacts were facing so that you can put it back in the right way when you put it back together. Lay the lower half aside and keep the buttons facing downward. Some of you have a loose reset button that may have fallen out during this process, or it may eventually fall out. If so, just lay it aside. Next, move the battery out of the way to expose the screw that's underneath. I used to tell people to disconnect the battery, but the connector can be very tight, and by removing it, you risk pulling the whole connector off the board, and if that happens, you have a pretty big problem. But I do have you disconnecting the battery in a couple of other solutions later on. So we're just gonna keep the battery off to the side, unscrew that screw that's under the battery holder, then remove the holder itself. For some of you, it'll come right off. For others, it's snapped into place with pegs, and those pegs can be very tight. Try to remove it with your fingers, but if you can't, stick something in there and just pry it out. Next, disconnect this ribbon cable. Some of you will have a gate that needs to be opened before you can pull it out. If you have any other screws on your circuit board, go ahead and remove them at this time. Now lay the battery back onto the board where the holder was. Keep the buttons facing down, but push up on the analog sticks. This will separate the lower shell. Some of you will have a slot for this ribbon cable, and you'll have to feed it through that slot as you separate it, or else it might get snagged and rip off. Examine the analog openings on this shell. If they have any kind of residue on them, clean them off with alcohol. You can use a Q-tip or a rag or whatever works. Water works too, just give it time to dry before you put the piece back on. Then take this half while holding the battery in place and turn it around and set it down. If a part falls off, set it aside for now. Later on, there's a segment where I show you how to put everything back together. Remove the umbrella caps. They come right off by pulling straight up. Do not twist them. Even if only one stick is giving you issues, you might want to just do a cleanup of both of them since you're already in here anyway. To that end, go ahead and clean both the umbrellas if they look dirty. With the umbrellas off, secure the battery with your hand and flip everything around again. Tap behind the analog sticks. If there's any debris in the silver boxes, there's a good chance it'll fall out. Flip everything back around again. Now blow into the mechanisms using a straw, canned air, or a hairdryer on the cool setting. Be sure to also blow on this little nub off to the side. If you look closely, you'll see it sits atop a tiny button. That's the R3 or L3 button, which triggers when you push on the top of the analog button. Also blow into the green doors that are on the side. There's teeny tiny openings along the top of those doors. That's pretty much the only way you can get air in there. Retest the controller. You can use the how to test segment I did earlier. If there's still no improvement, it's time to take things up a notch in the next solution. If you made it this far and still have an issue, it's time to move our attention to those green doors. Each one has a potentiometer inside that consists of a metal wheel up against a semiconductive coating. As you push your analog stick in a direction, it moves the wheel along the conductive coating, which in turn changes the value of the resistance, and that causes an action within the game. One of the things that happens is that debris gets onto the conductive coating, which disrupts the resistance readings. I speculate that some of the debris that gets in there is from the factory itself during the manufacturing process, which would explain why I have so many people telling me that their controller starts to drift only after a few months. Another thing that happens is that the metal over time scrapes and degrades the conductive coating. This kind of damage is permanent, and only replacing the entire door would bring it back to 100%. The replacement option is shown later in this video. Regardless, we're going to hope that it's debris in the doors that's causing your issue, and in this solution we're going to attempt to clean it in an indirect way by flushing it with liquid. As a precaution, we're going to disconnect the battery. Since we're going to be wetting things, there's a small chance that you might get shocked, or the current from the battery might jump to a sensitive part of the controller and cause damage. You have to pull apart this connector right here. One side of the connector is on the board and the other is on the wires. The problem is that this connector is very tight. If you pull on the top piece and it doesn't come loose, you could rip the bottom piece off the board. I'm going to tell you how to disconnect it in a way that minimizes that risk, but if it does happen, it's a pretty big problem that cannot be resolved easily without some complex soldering. There is a YouTuber that shows how to do it, and I'll put a link to that video in the description. If you don't want to risk it, feel free to skip to the next solution. The ideal way to disconnect the battery is to pull on the top piece while pushing down on the lower piece. One way to do that is to place your thumbnail on the lower piece and pull the upper piece up with some needle nose pliers. Don't squeeze the plastic too hard with the pliers or you might damage it. Do a slight rocking motion with the pliers as you press down with your thumbnail. It should come up a little bit, and then you can just use your fingers the rest of the way instead of the pliers. So we are going to be dumping liquid into the analog stick, and the best place to do that is at the bottom of a sink. Or you could just do it on top of a rag or something, but be careful if you're using alcohol. You don't want an alcohol-soaked rag sitting around for too long because it's flammable. Start dousing the problematic analog stick with alcohol or water. Make sure you are drenching the green doors. There are tiny gaps at the top of the doors, so that's the best place to drench it. Use a toothbrush to add more liquid and scrub it down to make sure it's penetrating everywhere. Move the stick around as you do this. Try to keep the liquid confined to the area around the stick. It may be problematic if it gets inside the vibration motors that are out in the handles of the controller. After you've drenched the stick quite a bit, start draining the liquid out. Turn it upside down and tap it. Then you need to get a fan blowing to dry everything. If you're using water, I advise you dry it for at least 5 hours. You don't want anything wet when you put the controller back together. It's going to make your character do weird stuff because the electricity is going to be jumping around, but it's also going to potentially rust things inside your controller. If this solution doesn't work, move on to the next one. If the indirect approach to cleaning the conductive coating didn't work, it's time to open the doors and clean them from the inside. This is one of the most effective solutions I show you today, but it comes with risk. The doors are fragile pieces of plastic, so they may get mangled in the process, making them impossible to close back completely. One of the upcoming solutions involves soldering in a new door, so it's not completely hopeless if the door does break. If you listen to everything I'm about to tell you, you can minimize the risk of breaking the door. First off, take things apart as shown in solution 7. This time there's no need to disconnect the battery. Take the time to understand how the door is built. It has 3 metal legs at the bottom that go into the board. You will be bending those legs when we open the door. We want to make sure they don't snap off the board while we are doing the bending. The green door itself is clamped onto the metal box by 2 tabs and 3 pegs. Notice how there's 2 pegs on one side of the door and 1 peg on the other. We're going to call this one the 3rd peg. When the door is snapped onto the metal, that 3rd peg is on the right side. It's important to know about the location of that peg when you go to open the door. When we open the door, we need all the tabs and pegs to come out smoothly from the box. If a peg gets bent a lot, it's going to make it hard to close the door back. By the way, you should open both of the doors on the problematic analog stick. And I advise you don't open the doors at all on the analog stick that is not giving you an issue. Let's begin the opening. First of all, take a small tool and push in the tiny tabs. They're located on each side in the middle of the door. Just a gentle, precise nudge. This will make it easier to open the door. Then take a tiny flathead screwdriver or a razor blade and gently push it in between the metal and the plastic right here and do a small prying motion. You just want to get the door slightly open like this. You need to do the rest of the prying not from the top, but from deeper within the door, close to where the third peg is situated. Also, you should be able to see the white disc in there, and when you stick your tool further in there, you'll need to be on this side of the disc. If you put it on this side, you're going to affect the metal contacts that are only on that side of the disc. So stick your screwdriver or razor blade down in there on the side of the third peg and pry it until the door opens up quite a bit. Pull out the wheel with some tweezers. The semiconductive coating is inside the door. If you look closely, you'll see a greenish tint. That's the coating. Blow on it, then take a Q-tip dipped in alcohol and clean it. If you don't have alcohol, use water. But if you do use water, put a fan on it afterward and dry it completely before attempting to close the doors. If you look at the wheel, there's one side that has some metal on it, and there's two metal loops at the top of it that bend outward a little bit. Those are what move across the conductive coating. Blow on them and then clean them with the gentlest of motions. You don't want to press down on those loops. They need to be poking outward. Now comes the difficult part, putting the wheel back into the chamber and getting the door to close. First, make sure it's oriented correctly. The metal hoops that stick out need to be on the top of the door, facing outward. This little piece needs to go through the hole on the center of the wheel. You can either hang the wheel on that little piece, or you can place the wheel into the door. Before you completely close it, take a look at that third peg. It more than likely bent, and if it's very bent, you need to bend it back a little bit. Right here, mine is a little bit more bent than I would like it to be, so I'm going to unbend it a little bit. The idea is to make it smoothly go through the hole as you're shutting the door. Put some pressure on the area where the third peg is, and if all goes well, the whole thing would just snap together and close. If the door isn't closing, it could be that the wheel just isn't in the right position. It could also be because one of the pegs is damaged. If one of the pegs is mangled too much, you should be able to cut it off with a razor blade and then just close the door just fine, because there's a lot of redundancy with 3 pegs and 2 tabs. If you do cut any pieces off, just make sure you blow those pieces out of the controller, or else that stuff's going to be rattling around in there and cause problems. If the door just refuses to close, or you have broken it in some way, go to the last solution and see if you want to try installing a new door. Also, it's possible that the door may shut, but for whatever reason, the analog stick problem gets much worse. In that case, try opening the doors again, taking the wheels out, and closing the doors again. Maybe something was just out of alignment or something. This solution involves doing everything in the previous solution, except instead of cleaning, switch the wheel out with another one. I've had a few people tell me that this worked. You can switch it with another controller or with another analog stick on the same controller. You could also order one, which usually comes with a door. There are tons of them on Amazon, and they're findable with these keywords. However, it's impossible for me to order all of them and test them to see if they fit correctly, so buyer beware. This solution involves desoldering the doors and installing new ones. Much like I said in the last solution, you need to find doors that fit your metal box. More than just that, not only should they fit your metal box, they need to function within your metal box. Take for instance this one right here. It's a generic analog stick off Amazon. I removed a door from it and used that one to replace a door on this controller. The soldering went well, but the door doesn't function correctly. I can't go all the way down. The stick feels like it's hitting something, and something is off when I go in other directions too. The bottom line is, you should only solder in a door that's from another DualShock 4 stick. Maybe you can find a cheap broken one on eBay that at least has one door that functions fine. Also, this method involves medium level soldering. If you've never soldered before, I don't recommend doing this process until you've mastered some of the basic things, such as solder removal and how to use flux. If you want to learn these basics in the fastest way possible, I suggest you go over to the channel called How Do You DIY and watch some of the soldering tutorials that he has. I'll link to one of his videos in the description of this one. I do not have an extra door from a DualShock, so in this demo, I'll be soldering in the generic one I was talking about a moment ago. Like I said, don't use generic ones, but it'll work fine for showing you the soldering process here. To proceed with the repair, make sure to disconnect the battery if you haven't already, which I showed at this timestamp. Then disconnect the 4 wires that lead to the vibration motors by applying just a little bit of heat. Keep track of which color wire went to which pad. I'm not sure if yours is going to match up the same with mine, because like I said, there's been a lot of revisions. Then pull the board out. This one has 2 tiny tabs holding it in, and pressing on them releases the board. Each door has 3 metal feet soldered to the board. Identify where those are at. The most challenging thing about doing solder work on a DualShock 4 is that it's very hard to get the existing solder to melt. There's apparently 2 reasons for this. One is that they're using a solder with a high melting point. And 2, any points that are attached to ground dissipate heat quickly because of the way the ground plane is designed. In order to get things melting, first add flux to the 3 points, and then add solder to each of them. I'm using a 6040 with a rosin core, which has a lower melting point than what's on the board. By blending this solder with the original solder, it lowers the overall melting point, and the flux helps it bond together. Fattening up the solder points also makes it easier to heat them all up. Add some more flux, then heat all 3 points as simultaneously as you can. And while you do that, pull the door from the other side with a tool. I'm laying the iron across all 3 points for the most part, but you may have better luck if you use a wedge tip. One of these legs is ground, so that one will be harder to melt. You don't want to keep the iron on these points for too long, or else you're going to start melting things on the board, such as the analog stick itself. You really have to control the heat as much as you can and not go too far over what you need to have. Some of the metal legs may snap, which is okay. You now need to remove as much solder as you can from the 3 holes, and remove any remains of the legs if they're still on there. Let the board cool down first, just to make sure you don't get too out of control with the heat. Then add more solder and flux, and use a solder sucker or a braid to remove the solder. You need to remove it all, so you're left with 3 holes, and you can peek through them and see all the way through the board. Put the new door into place, snap it shut, and add solder to the 3 points. Do the same process for the other door, and then clean the whole entire area with isopropyl alcohol. Retest and see how it behaves, and don't forget those wires that need to be soldered back onto the board. You may wonder, why not have a solution where I show how to replace the entire analog stick? I am no longer going to recommend anyone do that. I've been successful at it in the past, but a few times it was quite a struggle. All the challenges of replacing the door are magnified. Instead of heating 3 points at a time, you have to do it on 8. Heating up all 8 is almost impossible without the use of a heat gun. I've seen one person use like a hot plate or something, but I couldn't find that video. But there's always other ways. The thing about the heat gun is it's a lot harder to control the heat, in my opinion, and that can melt some of the components on the board. Even if you did successfully replace the analog stick, it may all be for nothing, because if you order a generic stick off Amazon and install it, it may not function correctly, because the new stick would not be calibrated to that particular controller. Sony does not have an open calibration tool like the Switch does, but let me know if you have done stick replacements, and let me know if you have had to do some kind of calibration in order to make them work. Here's how to put your controller back together. Pop the board back in, if you made it that far in the video. Reconnect the battery. If one of the trigger buttons came off, put it back on. But there's two kinds of trigger buttons. There's ones with tails and ones without tails. The tail ones pop in pretty easily. The non-tail ones are more complex. A spring may have fallen out when that button came off. I'm going to assume the worst and tell you how to put that spring back in and place the button back into place. This upcoming segment is from an older video, so my voice may sound a little bit different. Tilt the button upside down so that you have the little pegs at the top. If it's R2, place the spring over the peg that's on the left, like so. If it's L2, put it on the right side peg. Don't do it this way. There's a little slot under that peg. One leg of the spring needs to go into that slot. It doesn't snap into it, it just kind of lays there loosely. Flip the button like this. There's a tiny slot on the controller side that the other leg of the spring fits into. Bring the controller up to it like this. You may need to hold the battery in place as you do this. Land the leg into the slot and snap the button into place. Place the inside frame back into place. Some of you will have to feed this ribbon cable through a little slot. Insert that ribbon cable back into its connector. Some of you have a gate that needs to be open when you stick it in, and once it's in, you shut the gate. Bear in mind that this connector leads to the touchpad. In the end, if the touchpad is not working, go back in and just check the way you plugged this ribbon in. Put the battery holder back on. Some of you will need to snap it into place. For everyone else, it just kind of lays there on top of the board. Put the screw back into place. Make sure you get it all the way in because it basically holds the whole thing together. Some of you will have a loose reset button that may have come out. Drop it back into place. Put the battery back into the holder and make sure the QR code on the battery is facing upward. There's a little bit of a hook that you can wrap the battery wires into. Take the other half of the shell and stick the ribbon cable that's on it into the connector that's on the other half. This is very tricky to do, and it's also where a lot of people make a mistake. There's metal contacts on one side of the ribbon, and they need to face a certain way, and for some of you, it's away from the battery, and for others, it's toward the battery. And it depends on what revision you have. If your connector is 100% vertical like this one, the metal contacts need to be facing the battery. If your connector is tilted like this one, the contacts should face away from the battery. By the way, this cable powers the light and the charging port, so if those things aren't functioning when this is all put together, come back and make sure that this cable is secure and facing the right direction. Place the two halves back together. So that's all I had today. I hope you found this video useful. Have a great day, everybody.